optimism in the U.S. is slowly returning, given largely positive economic indicators as of late. But as you heard from my headline, the Federal Reserve, in its effort to pick up the slack of non-existent fiscal policy, might be creating another bubble in the process. Now, Chris Martenson of peakprosperity.com largely agrees with this general view, and I sat down with Chris to discuss his video series called The Crash Course, which was released before the Great Financial Crisis, and I asked him what has changed since the release of these videos. Here's what he had to say.
You know, we had an opportunity to revisit all of the data, look at everything. My team and I, we went through every piece of data, 2008, 6 years ago now. So what we wanted to do was update it, bring all of the data into current format, and also ask ourselves, what's really changed in this story? Where did we get things wrong? What did we get right? And so this new version has all the data, includes shale oil, shale gas, all of those developments. And here's the punchline. Many of the trends that we saw in the first place that we warned about and that concerned us back in 2008, those are still with us. In many cases, they're larger.
Now, I understand that you're updating the Crash Course and releasing a new video series. Is that right?
That's absolutely right.
And will you talk about the new problems that you just mentioned before?
Absolutely. So we've got two things out there. First is the full crash course. That's 28 chapters now. Goes into everything, the economy, energy, the environment. Our thesis is you have to look at all three of these together now. You can't look at any one in isolation. Like the Federal Reserve wants to just look at money and cram money into this situation and somehow things will work. So we've got that full one. And then one of the most common requests we got was for a much shorter version that you could help spread the word, show it to friends, family, neighbors, and we call that the accelerated crash course. That's out as well, just 53 minutes long, and it weaves all of those pieces together, and I think does a very good job of explaining what we're seeing in the world today.
So here's my question. Why do you think the next 20 years will be nothing like the last 20 years?
Oh, Erin, for the simple reason that we don't have cheap oil anymore. We always had cheap oil. We've always been able to park that into the equation as an assumed thing that just happens when you dump more money into the equation. We don't have that anymore. It doesn't matter how much technology advances at this point. The shale plays, the ultra deep water finds, the tar sands, those things are expensive to prosecute. And so we've got expensive oil now slowly swapping out the cheap oil that we built everything around. Now, this is a very interesting and loaded statement that the next 20 years are going to be unlike the last 20 years because everybody in power, everybody sitting on the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C., at all the institutions, they think they know how the world works based on the fact that of how we're operated under cheap oil. We don't have that anymore, and we don't see anybody in power really dealing with that concept, and we think it's very important.
Chris, how much will technology be able to overcome some of the climatic, resource, and demographic constraints that we face?
Well, technology can certainly play a role. We'd feel a lot better at Peak Prosperity if we collectively had started applying technology 20, 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. There's a lot we could do. For instance, natural gas. We could be swapping out to natural gas, using it for transportation, using it for more of our electrical generation needs, things like that. And we're not really doing that at this point in time. We're waiting for the market to figure this out. We don't think we have time for the market to figure out how to deliver to us natural gas-powered vehicles. We think that what we see in the oil data all around the world tells us that we are pretty much at max capacity right now for traditional conventional oil. We think that we're going to see a peak of that in the world stage in terms of exports, starting probably now, but by 2016, 17, it's really going to start to bite. That's not a lot of time. And so we really believe that technology can play a role, but every day that we wait to apply that technology, the harder it's going to be to apply that technology and the less its impact is actually going to be.
Now, Chris, this is a little off script here, but one of our producers here, Jonathan Kim, he said to me after you were on the last time, we might have hit peak oil, but I don't think that we've hit peak consumption. I thought that was quite astute. But I want to ask you, if we haven't hit peak consumption, how does this play out in the markets?
Well, Erin, every single market in the world, be those the bond markets, which are the largest markets, just the debt in the OECD countries is now over $100 trillion with a T, trillion. We've got the global equity markets. Both of those rely on this assumption that we're going to have growth. You know, you wouldn't loan somebody $100 trillion if you didn't think they were going to pay the interest and the principal back. What's the interest represent in the story? It represents growth. So call the weighted average interest in the bond market 3-4%, whatever you want to call it today. Without 3 or 4% growth in the future, it becomes impossible to pay those debts back. And so that's the circumstance we're in. This idea around, are we at peak consumption? I don't know yet. People definitely want to consume. We want the economy to grow. Our financial system needs it to grow. Here's the part of the story that gets really interesting. We don't have the oil coming out of the ground like we need in order to get the kinds of growth that we wanted to see in the past. Hey, I think it explains a lot. It explains why oil's over 100 a barrel. It explains why the trillions dumped in by the central banks has not ignited the kind of economic recovery we expected and even required in the system. So those are some of the big risks that we look at.
Now, Chris, what about the ability for policy responses to end the specter of over-indebtedness, malinvestment, and cronyism? Now, don't you think one more crisis, just only one, could be enough to force a rethink of policy altogether?
Well, it'd be nice if it did. I thought 2008 was our natural shot across the bow. We should have done some things. What could we have done? We could have said, wow, derivatives are dangerous. Let's have fewer of them. We could have said too big to fail doesn't work. Let's make things not too big to fail. We could have said, wow, sovereign debt loads were kind of too high. Let's see if we can bring those backwards. Erin, each one of those three things is now much larger, much worse than it was even in 2008. So those would have been good times for policy to come forward and say, hey, just on an economic basis, we lived beyond our means for about 30 or 40 years. And by that, I mean we were borrowing at about twice the rate that our income was growing. So debts grew at 8% per annum for 40 years straight. The income, the GDP under that, grew at about 4%. So what we're looking at here is an idea that, yeah, we could make different decisions, but nobody's been willing to bite that bullet yet. Even the vaunted austerity that we see in Europe, I don't see it when you look at debt to GDP numbers in any of the nations that are apparently struggling under austerity. They're all still spending faster than their income is growing.
Now, we were debating these issues in the office and wondering how many resources rich countries would put to bear to deal with the strains of resource depletion or climatic stress. Now, I mean, aren't rich countries in a much better position in this score than, say, a Bangladesh or a Namibia?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think the winners and losers as we go forward is clearly defined by who has access to resources and who doesn't. So resource-poor nations have always been poor. I think that dividing line just gets a little bit more stark as we go forward. Now, you mentioned wealthy nations versus not wealthy nations. If a nation has the ability to keep importing the resources it needs, it will obviously have a much better chance at the appearance, if not the reality of prosperity, than nations that can't do that. This is, of course, the risk around.
That was Chris Martenson of peakprosperity.com.